And we raised money to fund studies, and we try to do about one a year. The study that came out when I was president was about misdemeanor meeting and pleading, which was going on really heavily in Washington State, and then we studied it and found out it was going on in plenty of other places where misdemeanants would come to court and they would essentially plead guilty without a lawyer in order to expedite the process. Yet that conviction would end up becoming something that they could be revoked on and go to jail for later, even though they never had a lawyer. The study is founded, or all our studies are funded through the Foundation for Criminal Justice. We gather the grants. There have been one virtually every year. The 50th anniversary of Gideon versus Wainwright, which was 1963. In 2013, we had a report on Gideon and how the promise of Gideon that everybody should have an appointed lawyer, that for a public defender system at minimum, or lawyers through a counsel system like the federal government uses, as well as public defenders, has really been an unfulfilled promise because so many people don't get adequate counsel, or public defender systems are underfunded, I should say, not unfunded, but underfunded. And in some states, it gets worse and worse and worse, like Kansas, for instance, where the governor decided he'd just eliminate state income tax. And everybody went along with that in the legislature because it was a Republican legislature. And now they can't fund anything. They can't fund schools. They can't fund the courts. They can't fund virtually anything, even roads and bridges. And that's the way he wanted it, and now there's backlash, and it's even possible because of that underfunding that's affected the entirety of the criminal justice system in Kansas, he may actually lose at the next election. We don't know that, but he's got a viable Democratic opponent who's getting a lot of traction. I hate that word, but that's what it really is. That person is getting more and more people on board because they realize you just can't unfund government and be able to perform or provide basic services. This study, believe it or not, was funded, I believe, largely in part by the Koch Foundation. The Koch Foundation, nobody in NACDL agrees with, or the Koch brothers agree with, but the Koch Foundation is actually an amazing organization that provides almost $1 billion a year in funding around the country. If anybody watches Lawrence O'Donnell on MSNBC, you find out that the first show he did after he came back from his horrible car wreck in the Virgin Islands, he was flown to New York City by NBC, and he was immediately sent to the orthopedic center at Columbia University, and who was at Presbyterian Hospital. It was the Koch brothers' wing. Turned out they had funded that. All he'd done is spoken against the Koch brothers forever, and now he softened up a little bit and said, they spent $100 million funding this wing of this hospital that helped me. And then he reported they'd also given $100 million to the NYU law school, or not law school, med school, and many other things. And NACDL gets about $5 million every other year from the Koch Foundation because they believe, as we do, in an over-criminalization makes it impossible for people to ever get free of the criminal justice system, because there are like 4,500 laws and regulations just in the federal system, 4,500 laws that can be criminalized. For instance, you can go to jail because you violated a part of the Code of Federal Regulations on overfishing or catching a certain type of fish. And you may not even know that that's against the law because you go to the statute book and never see it. But Congress and the executive branch keep passing more and more regulations. They want more and more crimes, more and more things to be crimes, and as a result, more and more people are getting caught up in the criminal justice system. This task force probably spent 3 years working on this report. It came out in May, late May, and it was a long time in the drafting process because it came before the NACDL board in March. And then there were a couple of minor changes, and then it was finally released in late May. And John Sarna from Arkansas had on his radio program, was able to have people from NACDL who were called into the program. They didn't have to travel to Arkansas to be on it. And it was streamed live on the internet as well. And it's hopefully preserved on somebody's website, either the radio station or RSOL's in Arkansas. So you can go download it there, but it had the chair of the group that wrote this report, Rick Jones, who is NACDL's first vice president, or will become this year. He's a public defender from the Bronx, who's been an NACDL member forever, and now he's going to be president someday. It takes 6 years to become a president of NACDL because you have to work your way up through the organization to understand how it operates. You just don't run and become president one day. You start out at the low end as secretary, and then if you prove yourself as a secretary, then you used to be treasurer, then one of the vice presidents, then president-elect. And Rick will be president in 3 more years. The title of the report from this Task Force on Restoration of Rights, which was organized in 2011, so it took 3 years to get the report out. Collateral Damage, America's Failure to Forgive or Forget in the War on Crime. And its Collateral Damage was chosen as the title because of collateral consequences, which we all know happens in virtually every criminal case. And at the end, I'm going to give you the way to get this. It's available as a PDF, free online. And at the very end, I'll give you the short version of how to get to it, not some long URL that you have to write down, because it'll be really easy to find. They took testimony around the country in various cities and invited people. And the group, there were 7 or 8 in the group that would travel to hear all this testimony, and then they'd make notes about the testimony. The testimony was transcribed. That's part of what the funding was for. And then the transcripts are available, and probably they're also online at NACDL's website. But they met in all these cities, and in D.C., they actually got George W. Bush's pardon counsel to come in and testify. But 150 different witnesses came in and testified, and the Columbia Law School provided law students who summarized all the testimony so it would be easier to manage this information because it produced tens of thousands of pages of transcript. And they took as people to testify, of course, people with a conviction to testify to what happened to them, why I couldn't get a job, defense attorneys dealing with talking about the difficulty and even knowing about all the collateral consequences. Sometimes you don't even know what's going to happen to them. You try to learn to do the best you can, but you can't always completely predict. Judges who've been offended by the consequences. Virtually everybody who testified was in our corner on this. It was somebody that had some good input. Anybody who had anything bad to say, I'm sure we listened to what they had to say, but it didn't become part of the report or became a footnote, that was just sort of a dissenting view. Prosecutors who agree, social scientists, reentry professional, people trying to deal with getting people back into the system. Some state and local federal officials, some former ones, a former governor who believes in it, and I'll give you an example from Arkansas. When Mike Huckabee was governor, he was a firm believer in second chances. You may not agree with his politics, maybe you do, that doesn't matter, but he was a firm believer in second chances, and he granted about 750 clemencies of people that were in prison to shorten their terms and let them out. And that's exactly what the clemency power is all about. His successor, Mike Beebe, in 7 years has granted 8, and the only ones he's granted are ones where it was a co-defendant, for instance, who got more time, and it could be shown, for instance, a black and white co-defendant in a case where the white defendant got, say, 8 years for the crime, and the black defendant got 12, and they were exactly the same. There was no difference in their history or anything like that, and he shortened that sentence, for instance. But he was completely incapable of ever granting clemency, and I don't know why they even bothered to go through the process. I counseled people, once it was obvious what he was doing, not to even bother, just wait till he's out of office and make a new application. Also in Arkansas, your applications time out after a certain time. The process, when it gets to the governor, takes a year for the process. It goes through the parole board first on a clemency application. Parole board recommends it either with merit or without, and about half the time they'll recommend it with merit. And the governor just ignored it, even though they would say it was with merit. It would get to the governor's office, and everything had to follow a certain paper trail. And that was so there wouldn't be any preferences, because in the old days it was rumored, for instance, back when Since everybody's dead, I can talk about this. When Faubus was governor, he would leave town, and then his lieutenant governor would grant clemencies and pardons and just sign off on them, and then they'd split the money. Supposedly they were all paid for. And remember, past governors in Illinois have gone to prison for that. Out of the last 7 governors in Illinois, 4 have gone to prison. The first one went to prison for selling clemencies. A governor in Tennessee went to prison for selling clemencies. That supposedly do that. But nevertheless, in Arkansas, and then there was no process at all. You just made a short application to the governor, I want clemency, I want a pardon, and he granted or not. Now it's a hugely complicated process with a long form that's got to be filled out. There are all kinds of things attached. The parole board investigates, they check your criminal history, they check your references, and then they make their own recommendation. And believe it or not, half the time they recommend shortening sentences. Because Arkansas is a jury sentencing state. There's only 5. In a jury sentencing state, you can end up with completely arbitrary sentences. The same marijuana case, good example. A marijuana case in Little Rock, you could plead it to probation if it's 50 pounds or less, usually. In some parts of the state, you can't. And if you can't, why is there that difference? It should be uniform statewide. There's a case in South Arkansas where a guy sold 1 rock of crack, and a jury gave him life because the range of punishment was 10 to 40 years or life, and it was at 1/4 parole eligibility. It got finally up on federal habeas to the 8th Circuit, and they said that was cruel and unusual because the same crime in the federal system, at worst, would get the guy 15 months. I mean, he got life, so they reduced, the federal courts reduced that sentence. But we're a jury sentencing state, so arbitrariness happens throughout. The prosecutors, of course, are kind of a gatekeeper. They make plea recommendations. You don't like it, the plea recommendation, you can plead to the court. If you plead to the court has to go by sentencing guidelines. This is Arkansas. But the sentencing guidelines are not mandatory. They're just advisory, and they can ignore them if they want. They can just make a justification, the seriousness of the crime. Even though it wasn't, they can just sign off on that. Seriousness of the crime requires a higher sentence, and then they impose it. All this ends up in the governor's hands when actually there's a lawyer who works on the governor's staff who does the preliminary review and then sits down with him once a week. And why they bothered even go through that process, I don't know, but he's really looking for certain types. He's out of office come January 15th. There'll be a new governor, and we don't know who it is yet because, of course, it's contested. Remember, Michael Vick got a second chance. And think about this. Pro football fans were so glad to have Michael Vick back playing, but how did they think about how many people ostracized the pro football player who came out as gay? When he got drafted, he admitted it, he already told everybody locally he was gay, but until he got drafted by the NFL, it wasn't public knowledge nationwide. And he gets ostracized, but Michael Vick is back playing and signed a really big contract. One that's not even listed in here is Wesley Snipes. Wesley Snipes, you notice, hasn't been in the movies for the last 4 years because he's been in a federal pen on a tax charge. He was convicted of 4 misdemeanors, and he was apparently pissed off the judge so much about what he was convicted of. The judge gave him 4 one-year sentences and made them consecutive. So he ended up serving 4 years on what should have been a 1-year conviction at the most, logically, and it was appealed, and the federal appellate court sustained the convictions. So he spent 3+ years in a federal pen, and he's out, but he's self-employable, so he can get back to work. And I saw a trailer for a movie he's in that comes out next week. That's probably the first movie he's been in since he got out of prison, so it takes a year for a movie to come out. Martha Stewart, for example, her crime of conviction required that she had to resign from the board of her own company under federal law, so she could run the company from prison, theoretically. Actually, you can't. If you're in prison, you supposedly can't run a business. But when she got out, she only served 5 months. When she gets out, though, she had to be kicked off the board of her own company, but for 5 years, by federal law required it. That was a collateral consequence of her conviction, but she had a trial, and she didn't plead guilty going into it. She got tried and convicted, and she ended up finally getting back on the board of her company, and then she was CEO again in 2012. An example that they found, which they thought was very important for the report, a woman completed her dental assistant apprenticeship in a federal prison. They do this, they train people for certain types of jobs so they can learn to do these things. And I've talked to a woman who went through one of these programs, and then when they get out, they can't find work. Why does the federal prison system give people these jobs and this training for something they're never going to get work for? And you'd think that the federal government would wise up and say, we need to find some way to undo that collateral consequence. If we're going to train people for a job they can never hold, why bother? I've got a client who's about to go into prison, and he wants to go to a camp where they build furniture, because he used to do that when he was younger. He's 73 years old. He's going to go away for about 4 years. But he wants to build furniture, and he knows he can do that. If you've ever been in a federal courthouse, you know that all the furniture is built in federal prisons. And they do a great job because they're very skilled artisans. You'd think, how much money does the federal government pay for this furniture? Well, it's made with prison labor at 70 cents an hour or whatever they charge. I represented a man who pled guilty to a drug offense. He tried to get a real estate license. He had a real estate license. He went to renew it, and they wouldn't give him his real estate license because a drug conviction bars you from having a real estate license, of all things. I could see a theft conviction because people are letting people into their houses to show the house because the key may be locked hanging on the door. But a drug conviction, what's that got to do with, well, I guess I could say they could go through the drugs in somebody's house or go through their medicine cabinets, and I'd represented somebody who did that. They broke into houses. They got into houses somehow, and one person would distract the homeowner, and then they'd go to the bathroom and they'd rummage around for the controlled substances and steal them.
How about a sex offender?
Well, of course, they're going to say the same thing, letting people in the house, because they'd say, well, you're probably scouting the house out. But in Arkansas, any felony conviction prohibits you from getting a real estate license. Any felony conviction. If a drug offense does, then surely everything else does. And this is another bad example. A woman worked at the Bank of America, and she gets arrested on a shoplifting charge. The prosecutor, in a case, they do this in New York, it's called an adjournment and contemplation of dismissal, where they say, we're just going to pass this case, and if you stay out of trouble, nothing happens. Arkansas, we do that all the time. In first offense shoplifting, we can get a case passed for 6 months like that. It's just passed for 6 months, you stay out of trouble, the case disappears. It's literally can be expunged at that point, after that 6 months is up. But federal law barred her from working at Bank of America because of even that adjournment. She was never convicted, but lost her job because of a federal statute that said she couldn't work at a bank because essentially she was charged and it did not end up as a not guilty verdict. You could decide, I'd rather take the adjournment rather than go through the trial. It's cheaper. I don't have to pay for a lawyer to go through the trial. I eliminate the risk of being found guilty even though I'm innocent. I would rather take the adjournment and contemplation of dismissal, not knowing it was going to cost her her job, and it did.
I mean, if she had not done this, gone to trial, been found not guilty, then would she not have lost her job?
Then she wouldn't have lost her job. But she didn't know that just the adjournment and contemplation of dismissal cost her a job. And that's really common. People get kicked out of public housing for any kind of conviction, but in Arkansas, we've been finding a lot of people been complaining that landlords will just do a Google search. And if they find that you've been arrested for something, even if you've never been convicted, they won't rent to you. Doesn't even require a conviction because of Google. Google, at least, if you've probably heard about in the EU, the right to be forgotten. The European Union passed a law saying that at a certain point, things are so old and so negative that they can be removed from your record. Excuse me. And Google has agreed to recognize that, because if I want to do business in the European Union, they have to, because the European Union could say they're blocked from ever even operating there. Of course, they want the ad revenue, so they're applying the right to be forgotten. Google, though, as we found, if you can get a conviction expunged, Google will go in there and write an algorithm for your name, that name, so it will not come up anymore. It may still be on the internet, but it can't be found by Google if the conviction has been expunged. They've finally recognized that. It's not public knowledge, but they've done it, at least we've been able to get it done because we found out about it, that they got so tired of people contacting the legal department, it was easier to tell a programmer, look, just if somebody could show us, send us a copy of your expungement paper. You send it to us and we'll delete you. Can't delete you from somebody else's server, but we'll delete you so a search won't show your name. And it's been working. But if Google can do it, so can Bing, so can anybody else. A lawful permanent resident who served in one of our wars was deported because of a nonviolent conviction. All it's got to be is a crime of moral turpitude to be kicked out of the country, even if you're on a green card. If you're on a green card, you're safer than anybody else. Or not safer than a citizen. You're safer if you're on a green card, but you can be deported for many crimes, even though they're not a violent crime. One guy who's trained as a boiler room engineer, and if you're a labor union certified, that could be a very lucrative job. But because of his conviction, 25 years, he was out of that profession. Even though in Chicago, I went to Chicago one time for a matter in January, and it was probably as cold as being in Alaska that day. It's just horribly cold. They have, boiler room engineers are very trained specialists because it's hard work. You know, it takes a lot of time to learn, but he had a conviction that wasn't that bad, but it's still, he was barred from being a boiler room engineer, of all things. Why?